Under what circumstance is a believer in Christ allowed to divorce and remarry? Now, this is a very crucial question that we are going to look at together. I'm not going to make any conclusive statements. Whatever I'm going to be saying will be based on my own inferences, that is, my understandings and deductions from the scriptures. And I will open it up for you who is watching to also give your own views, your own understandings from the scripture. Now, for the purpose of learning, that everyone might be instructed and everybody can learn from this. There's an ongoing discussion before now about if a believer is allowed to divorce and remarry. I've had a lot of questions, I've had a lot of opinions, a lot of believers have given their own take and their own input on this subject. And a very interesting point was raised by another brother, I think Brother Obina, and I promised to address it in the video. The reason why I'm doing that in the video is so that we all can learn, so that I can open this subject for everybody to give their own contribution, their own input, so that we are all going to make deductions, inferences from what the scriptures say, and others can also learn and be instructed as well. That is why I said I am not going to be making any conclusive statements. I'm only going to be submitting my own inferences and understandings from plain statements in the Bible, what the Bible said about it, and then open it up for you to also give your own views and understanding, so that we all can be edified, we all can be built, we all can come to the point of understanding. In my last video, of course, a lot of people have, emphasized the statement that marriage is cultural, which we have done our best to prove to you from the scriptures that marriage is not cultural. I do not hope to address that in this video. I might do that, I might not do that. I may do a separate video to really prove if marriage is cultural or marriage is scriptural, as the case may be. But let us just address this particular one. When can a believer divorce? And when can a believer remarry? Is a believer permitted to divorce? And if the believer engages in divorce for whatever reasons the divorce takes place, is that believer permitted to remarry? Under what circumstance or on what ground can a believer who is divorced or who is no longer with their partner remarry? What did the Bible say about it? These are the things we're going to be looking at in this video. Now, the first point I want to address is Matthew chapter 19. Now, Jesus alone gave the ground upon which a believer can divorce. I have read through the New Testament. I really cannot lay my hands on any other scriptures that gave any ground upon which a believer can divorce his spouse. The only one I can lay my hand on is what Jesus Christ himself said. And that is in Matthew chapter 19 from verses 3. It's a lengthy reading. You could be patient with me. Let me hastily go over it. It says, some Pharisees came to him to test him. They asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? Verse 4, haven't you read, he replied, that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female. Now, Jesus referred them back to the beginning. That means the template for marriage is what God instituted from the beginning. And verse 5 said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. Verse 6, so they are no longer two but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. Verse 7, why then, they asked, did Moses command that a man gives his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? Now they're asking, if from the beginning God's institution or God's plan is that men should not divorce at all when they are married, why did Moses give them in those times, those under the law, permission to give their wives certificate of divorce, and then they can divorce them? Verse 8, Jesus replied, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. But it was not this way from the beginning. Why? That means from the beginning, there was no permission. There was not even permission that a man should divorce his wife. But because of the hardness of their heart, they are permitted to divorce. Now, verses 9, Jesus is now telling them, I am telling you now. This is not the law of Moses. This is not Moses that is talking. This is me, Jesus, giving you people the instruction. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another woman, commits adultery. Anyone, Jesus is not telling them, oh, of course, some of you may say Jesus is just talking to the Jews. This instruction Jesus is giving, it is people under the law that ask this question. Hence, it is for those who are under the law that they are not permitted to divorce except on the ground of sexual immorality. I remember somebody gave a comment like that. He said this instruction Jesus only gave to the Jews to show them how impossible it is to keep to the law. It doesn't apply to believers. But look at the next verse. It will debunk that statement. Verse 10. The disciples said to him, if this is the situation between a husband and wife, it is better not to marry. Now, the instruction Jesus gave, obviously to show to you that it is not just an instruction to the Jews, the scribes, the Pharisees, but for everybody. The disciples immediately picked on that and they say, if this is the case that a man must not divorce his wife unless on the ground of sexual immorality, the disciples say it is better than not to marry. That is, even all of us are a part of what you just said now. And look at verse 11. Jesus replied, not everyone can accept this word, but only those to whom it has been given. That is, not everyone can accept the fact that it is better not to marry. Because how do I know that because somebody can just come up and say, no, this statement, Jesus is saying not everyone can accept this word. He is referring to the statement I made earlier. The reason why I can conclude that this, not everyone can accept this, Jesus was referring to the thing the disciples said, which is, it is better not to marry, is because of verses 12. For there are eunuchs who were born that way, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others, and there are those who chose to live like eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. The one who can accept this should accept it. That is, the one who can accept that it is better not to marry should accept it. So this statement, not everyone can accept it. Jesus was not referring to the fact that he said you must not divorce your wife unless on the ground of sexual immorality. It is referring to the statement of the apostles or the disciples, that it is better not to marry. So Jesus has given the ground. You are not permitted to divorce your wife. He said, it's me that is telling you this. And that statement, obviously, we are proving that it is not just for the Jews and those who are under the law. It is for everybody that must enter the institution of marriage according to the ordinance of God, from how it was set from the beginning. This whole chapter clears it, that you are not permitted to divorce your wife on any ground, unless on the ground of sexual immorality. Now, there is a problem here with the issue of remarriage, because he said, anyone who divorces his wife unless on the ground of sexual immorality and marries another one commits adultery. Now, this statement does not emphatically make it clear if even after you divorce your wife on the ground of sexual immorality, you are permitted to remarry. I addressed this issue in a video before now, that there's a way we have to look at this scripture. We have to establish whether this, if you divorce and remarry on the ground of sexual immorality, is something that is addressed here. It could be that Jesus is saying divorce is only allowed on the ground of sexual immorality, but not that if you divorce on the ground of sexual immorality, you are still permitted to remarry. We have to prove if this statement actually carries both divorce and remarriage together. Now, I will come to talk about that, later on as we go on. Now, this verse has already established the ground that if you're a believer, you want to obey Jesus Christ, the only ground upon which you can divorce is if there is sexual immorality. Now, but what about remarriage? If you divorce on the ground of sexual immorality, are you permitted to remarry according to the statement of this Jesus? Now, based on what I told you, how Jesus said anyone who divorces his wife unless on the ground of sexual immorality and marries another and commits adultery, it could be that divorce separated, you could have, let me make it clear. You could have said anyone who divorces his wife and marries another unless on the ground of sexual immorality. It will show you that this unless on the ground of sexual immorality carries both divorce and remarriage together. But for him to bring unless in between divorce and remarry means on the ground of sexual immorality you can divorce, but not necessarily that you are permitted to remarry. Now, we will need to find further light on the statement of Jesus Christ in other places on the scriptures. And unfortunately, Jesus never addressed this issue further again. The only other person that addressed the issue of marriage is Paul. Now, of course, in Romans chapter 7, verses 2, we hear that, for example, by law, a married woman is bound to her husband as long as he is alive. But if her husband dies, she is released from the law that binds her to him. Now, because this Romans 7:2 is not really addressing the subject of marriage, Paul only borrowed this law on marriage to address a particular issue about our relationship with Christ. We are not really going to establish anything here, since the statement here was only used as an example to portray another point. So I would crave that we skip this together and move to 1 Corinthians 7 verses 10, where Paul was directly addressing the issue of marriage. Now, the reason why I said 1 Corinthians 7:10, where Paul was directly addressing the issue of marriage, was because if you go to the beginning of that 1 Corinthians 7, you will discover that there were questions that were asked by the Corinthians church. And I have to make a disclaimer here for those who keep saying Paul is talking to the Jews in this 1 Corinthians 7:10. Who are the Corinthians? Are Corinthians Jews? This is a letter of Paul to what? The believers in Corinth, not Jewish believers, those who are born again, and I think they should be Gentiles. I'm not sure. I've not really taken time to establish that, but I think those should be Gentile believers there. But all the same, Paul was addressing believers in 1 Corinthians 7, questions that were asked by believers, not by Jewish people. So never you make that mistake that Paul was talking to Jews. He was talking to believers who are concerned about certain issues of marriage and they want to know further. And then Paul was addressing the questions they asked. That debunked the statement of anybody that is saying Paul was talking to Jewish people. No, he was talking to believers, those who are born again in Christ. Now, let me read 1 Corinthians 7. I will skip from verse 1. You can read that just to portray the point I was trying to establish here. But let me read from verses 10. He says, to the married, I give this command, not I, but the Lord. Now, of course, this was made in bracket to include that, okay, this statement is not my opinion, Paul, I'm giving, but is the opinion of the Lord. A wife must not separate. Look at the word. A wife must not. Paul was talking to believers, so he's not talking up to Jews. A wife must not separate from her husband. But if she does, if she separates from her husband, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And a husband must not divorce his wife. Now, I can say this statement is a further addition to the statement of Jesus, but like I said, it's my own inferences. That means it's not a conclusive statement. It's based on my own perception and understanding. But obviously, a point is made here that a wife must not separate from her husband. He didn't give any reason why a woman would want to separate from her husband. Some people talk about domestic violence. Jesus talked about sexual immorality and many other reasons that are being given. But the Apostle Paul said here that a man must not separate from his husband, a wife must not separate from her husband, and a husband must not divorce his wife. And if in case separation happened or a divorce happened, each partner must remain unmarried. And if they don't want to remain unmarried, they should get reconciled back to their husband. Verse 12, to the rest, I say this, I, not the Lord, meaning this is my opinion now, not the opinion of the Lord. If any brother has a wife who is not a believer, if any brother, now based on my own inference, I can tell you that Paul is addressing those who gave their life to Christ after they are already married. Remember, the instruction of the apostle is always that as a believer, you must marry another believer. Now, but of course, in those days, there were people that had the gospel. They were already married before they had the gospel. And so those their other partner probably have not accepted the gospel yet, so they are not yet believers. And Paul is now saying, if any brother has a wife who is not a believer and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. Verse 13, and if a woman has a husband who is not a believer and he is willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. Verse 14, for the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise, your children will be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. I've already explained this earlier. I said, those days there are people who had the gospel before they gave their life to Christ. You know, who got married before they had the gospel and accepted Jesus Christ. And then later on, when they accepted Christ, they still had spouses that refused to accept the message of Christ or have not yet accepted the message of salvation. And Paul is saying, if that partner is still willing to stay with you, don't divorce the person. Why? Because remember, the apostle says, as a believer, you must marry another person that is already a believer. But in this case, since the marriage happened before you gave your heart to Christ, and now that you have given your heart to Christ, if that believer wants to remain married to you, you must not divorce him. What if the believer chooses to leave? After he discovers you are not a believer, he doesn't want to continue with that union. Verse 15 now answers that question. But if the unbeliever leaves, let it be so. The brother or the sister is not bound in such circumstances. God has called us to live in peace. How do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband, or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? Now, this further explanation in verse 15 says, now, in the case where the unbelieving wife or unbelieving husband chooses to leave, the apostle say a believer is not bound in that circumstances. In my previous videos, you would have heard me say this particular statement is contended for, because Paul didn't really directly say if the unbelieving wife or unbelieving husband leaves, the believer can now go and remarry another person. But based on the pretext, that is the statement that were made earlier about if the person chooses to stay, you must not divorce the person. We can now deduce that this word the believer is not bound in this case means if the unbelieving wife decides to leave, you are now free to remarry another one. Now that is an inference, and I've given you reason why this inference is made. You can give your own inferences or what you think or how you understand it in the comment section. Now, finally, verse 25. Now, about virgins, I have no command from the Lord, but I give a judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. Because of the present crisis, I think that it is good for a man to remain as he is. Are you placed to a woman? Do not seek to be released. Are you free from such a commitment? Do not look for a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. But those who marry will face many troubles in this life, and I want to spare you this. Now, I don't want to dwell so much on this place but I want you to mark the point. He said, because of the present crisis. I don't know what crisis they are having in that particular time that made him to address this statement. And like I said, I don't want to dive into that further. But let's round it up with verse 39 to 40. A woman is bound to her husband as long as he lives. But if her husband dies, she is free to marry anyone she wishes. But he must belong to the Lord. In my judgment, she is happier if she stays as she is. And I think that I too have the Spirit of God. Now, Paul have cleared this statement. Now, from this verse, the statement of Paul, I can now deduce or infer. I can deduce, please mark the word I can deduce or infer, that Paul is now saying there are only two conditions upon which a believer can remarry. One, if an unbelieving wife or an unbelieving husband chooses to leave the marriage after realizing that you have now become a believer and the person leaves, you are permitted to remarry. That is the first condition. The second condition I can say is if you have a spouse who dies. Aside from these two conditions, there is no any other ground upon which a believer is permitted to remarry. If you are with another spouse who is a believer and you say domestic violence or all of that, and you choose to separate from that party, there is no provision anywhere for you to remarry again, unless if that partner dies, from what the Apostle Paul said here. Like I said, somebody said this last statement, Paul was addressing Jews. Let's take the whole thing based on the context. The whole chapter, Paul was addressing the issue of marriage. He was not even trying to give example or try to quote the law. Let's not divert to that. That would be wrong and insincere of us. Now, the last statement I will make is a question that Brother Bina asked. He said, if you have a believer who is married, you are married to a believer, and the person begins to behave like an unbeliever, that is all those domestic violence and that, does that not qualify the person to become an unbeliever? And in that case, if the person leaves you, you are free to remarry. Now, of course, I wouldn't want to make a very definitive statement on that yet. I would leave it to the open public for us to decide. If a believer starts behaving as an unbeliever in marriage, does that qualify that person to be termed an unbeliever in the category that Paul was referring to in that earlier verse that I talked about? Remember, I told you that Paul was addressing unbelievers who have refused to accept the Lordship of Jesus Christ and become believers. And then you married them before you to accept the Lordship of Jesus. And then later you accepted the Lordship of Jesus. And that person is willing to stay with you, you should not divorce the person. But if the person leaves willingly, then you can remarry from the earlier statement. Now, but if you are in a marriage with somebody who has accepted Christ already, and then the person begins to demonstrate the attitude of unbelievers, like what we call domestic violence and all those other reasons, smoking, drinking, and all of that, is that enough ground for you as a believer to now decide to say, okay, because this person is behaving like an unbeliever, you should now leave the marriage in accordance to the word of Paul and go and marry another person? Remember, even the statement of Paul, he didn't say if the unbelieving husband or wife decides to stay with you. He said if the unbelieving husband or wife chooses to leave the marriage, then you are free to remarry. Now, but I would want to also ask a question. You are a believer. There are times you go into sinful activities and then you come and ask God to forgive you. So should we now conclude that when you go into sinful activities, you are now qualified to be called an unbeliever because you fell into sin? If we are going to say because a believer who goes to church, follows Christ, believes in Jesus Christ, engages in those things, he can now be termed as a believer in accordance to the word of our brother Obina. Now I leave that open for further questions and answers. Other believers put in your inputs from there. Then I would read the inputs and later come up with certain points to further add to this particular statement. Thank you for watching and thank you for connecting. Please, if you're just joining the channel now, you can subscribe to the channel, give this video a thumbs up so that more people can see it. Let's hear other people's opinion and mindset and understanding as well. And leave your comments too. Let's know the thoughts you have about the things that are being said here. God bless you and see you in the next video.